Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
Moving into the HOA complex 5 years ago, I thought I had found my little slice of paradise. The place was clean, quiet, and seemed like the perfect spot to settle down. But within weeks, I realized I had walked into a war zone, and the enemy was the HOA board, or, more specifically, John Smith and his gang of self-appointed neighborhood enforcers. John and his wife, Margaret, lived next door, and they were the kind of people who seemed to thrive on making everyone else miserable. They had been in the complex for years and had somehow managed to worm their way into positions of power on the HOA board. From the moment I moved in, they were on my case. Every little thing I did seemed to set them off. One evening, I was watching a movie with a friend. We weren't being loud, just talking and laughing at normal volumes. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door. I opened it to find John standing there, his face twisted into a scowl. "Do you realize how late it is?" he barked, his voice sharp and cutting through the quiet evening like a knife. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, and his face was twisted into a scowl that made it clear he wasn't there for a friendly chat. "Some of us have to wake up early, and your noise is unacceptable," he continued, his tone dripping with disdain. He didn't wait for a response, just stood there glaring at me as if I had committed some unforgivable crime. The way he said it made it sound like I was throwing a raucous party at midnight, not sitting in my living room watching a movie at 8:30 p.m. His presence alone was enough to make me feel like I was being scolded by a parent, not a neighbor. I tried to keep my voice calm, but the frustration was bubbling up. "It's 8:30, I said, gesturing toward the clock on the wall as if he might have somehow missed the time. "We're not being loud. We're just talking." But he didn't care. He cut me off with a wave of his hand, his expression hardening even further. "Loud enough to disturb us," he snapped, his words clipped and final. "Keep it down, or I'll have no choice but to report you to the strata board." And with that, he turned on his heel and marched back to his house, leaving me standing there in the doorway, stunned and fuming. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the way he delivered it, like he was the judge, jury, and enforcer of the entire neighborhood. "Loud enough to disturb us," he snapped. "Keep it down, or I'll report you to the HOA board." He turned and marched back to his house, leaving me standing there, fuming. My friend looked at me, wide-eyed. "What was that about?" she asked. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I muttered, closing the door. That was just the beginning. Over the next few months, John and Margaret became a constant source of stress. They would knock on my door for the slightest infractions. Music playing too loud, talking on the phone in my backyard, even walking too heavily on my own floors. They seemed to have a sixth sense for when I was doing anything that might remotely disturb them. It wasn't just me, either. I started noticing them confronting other neighbors. One evening, I heard shouting outside and peeked through my window to see John arguing with a young couple down the street. They had parked their car in a spot that John claimed was too close to his driveway. The couple tried to reason with him, pointing out that they were well within the rules, but John wouldn't back down. The police were called twice during these altercations, though nothing ever came of it. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. I was hosting a small gathering of friends in my backyard, a rare chance to relax and enjoy the weekend. The sun was shining, the grill was sizzling, and everyone was laughing and chatting, the kind of easy, carefree atmosphere that makes you forget about stress. We weren't being loud, just a group of friends catching up and enjoying the nice weather. But around 4 p.m., the mood shifted abruptly. John stormed over, his face flushed with anger, his steps heavy and deliberate like he was on a mission. He didn't even bother with a greeting or a polite request. Instead, he launched straight into a tirade, his voice booming across the yard. "This is outrageous," he shouted, his eyes darting around at my friends as if they were intruders. "You're disturbing the entire neighborhood with this racket." His presence was like a dark cloud, instantly killing the vibe and leaving everyone frozen in place, unsure of how to react. I stood up, my patience wearing thin. The weight of all the previous confrontations with John came crashing down on me, and I could feel the frustration bubbling to the surface. "John," I said, my voice steady but firm, "we're having a barbecue. It's the middle of the day, and we're not being loud. You need to stop harassing me and my guests." I gestured toward my friends, who were now sitting in awkward silence, their expressions a mix of confusion and discomfort. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel my heart pounding as I waited for his response. John's face twisted into a sneer, his eyes narrowing as if I had just insulted him. "Harassing," he spat, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He took a step closer, his presence looming over me like a storm cloud. "I'm trying to maintain some peace and quiet around here." His tone was sharp, each word cutting through the air like a knife. He didn't even try to hide the disdain in his voice, and it was clear he wasn't interested in having a reasonable conversation. "If you can't follow the rules," he continued, his voice rising with every word, "maybe you shouldn't be living here." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and final. It wasn't just about the noise. It was about control, about him asserting his authority over me and everyone else in the neighborhood. His words were meant to intimidate, to make me feel small and out of place in my own home. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my anger in check. "This is my home," I shot back, my voice rising to match his. "And I have every right to enjoy it without you breathing down my neck every 5 minutes." The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. This wasn't just about the barbecue or the noise. It was about standing up to someone who had been making my life miserable for far too long. The confrontation had been a long time coming, and there was no turning back now. "That was it," I snapped. "You know what, John? You're the one causing all the problems around here. You and Margaret have been terrorizing this neighborhood for years, and I'm done putting up with it. If you have a problem, take it up with the HOA board, but leave me the hell alone." He looked momentarily stunned, then turned and walked away without another word. For a while, things quieted down. John and Margaret stopped knocking on my door, and I thought maybe, just maybe, they had finally gotten the message. But it didn't last. Within a few weeks, they were back to their old ways, though they seemed to avoid direct confrontation with me. Then, one day, out of the blue, everything changed. A letter arrived in the mail from the HOA management company. It was addressed to all residents and announced that John Smith had been removed from the board for harassing residents. I couldn't believe it. I read the letter twice to make sure I wasn't imagining things. A few days later, I saw a "for sale" sign go up in front of John and Margaret's house. I didn't know what had happened behind the scenes, but I wasn't about to complain. They moved out a month later, and the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the peace didn't last long. The HOA board, now without John's iron fist, quickly descended into chaos. The remaining members, who had relied on John to do their dirty work, were completely inept. Meetings became shouting matches, and decisions were made arbitrarily, with no regard for the rules or the residents. One evening, I attended a HOA meeting to voice my concerns about the lack of maintenance in the complex. The moment I walked in, I could feel the tension in the room. The board members were arguing among themselves, and it was clear that nothing was going to get done. "This is ridiculous," I said, standing up, my voice cutting through the tense atmosphere of the meeting. The room was packed with frustrated residents, and the air was thick with frustration and resentment. "We're paying good money for this place, and it's falling apart," I continued, gesturing toward the cracked walls and overgrown landscaping visible through the window. "What are you going to do about it?" My words hung in the air, echoing the unspoken anger of everyone in the room. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the lack of accountability, the feeling that our concerns were being ignored. The board president, a woman named Linda, glared at me from across the table. Her expression was cold, her lips pressed into a thin line as if she were holding back a sharper retort. "We're doing the best we can," she snapped, her tone defensive and dismissive. She didn't even try to offer a solution or acknowledge the growing discontent in the room. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed, and added, "If you don't like it, maybe you should run for the board yourself." Her words were laced with sarcasm, as if the idea of anyone challenging her authority was laughable. The room fell silent, the tension so thick you could almost touch it. It was clear she wasn't interested in fixing the problem. She just wanted to shut me up. "Maybe I will," I shot back. "At least then someone competent would be in charge." The room erupted into chaos. Residents started shouting at the board, and the board members shouted back. It was a complete disaster. By the end of the meeting, nothing had been resolved, and everyone left angry and frustrated. Things only got worse from there. The board's incompetence led to a series of financial mismanagement scandals. Funds meant for maintenance and repairs were misused, and the complex began to fall into disrepair. Residents started withholding their HOA fees, and the board responded by threatening legal action. The final straw came when a group of residents, myself included, decided to take matters into our own hands. We hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit against the HOA board for negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. The case dragged on for months, but in the end, we won. The board was forced to step down, and a new board was elected. But the damage had already been done. The complex was in shambles, and the legal fees had drained what little funds were left. The new board tried to pick up the pieces, but it was too late. Property values plummeted, and residents started moving out in droves. As for John and Margaret, they never learned their lesson. Despite everything that had happened, they didn't seem to reflect on their behavior or consider how their actions had affected others. I heard through the grapevine that they had moved to another HOA complex, and it didn't take long for the stories to start circulating. Apparently, they were already causing trouble there, picking fights with neighbors, nitpicking over petty rules, and trying to assert their control over anyone who crossed their path. It was almost predictable, like a broken record playing the same tune over and over. Some people never change, no matter how many times they're called out or forced to face the consequences of their actions. It was both frustrating and oddly satisfying to know that their new neighbors would soon understand exactly what we had been dealing with for years. In the end, the HOA complex became a glaring example of what happens when power is abused and placed in the wrong hands. What was meant to protect and serve the residents instead turned into a system of control and harassment, with the board wielding their authority like a weapon. Even though we succeeded in dismantling the corrupt leadership, the damage they caused ran deep. The trust that had been broken and the divisions they created left lasting scars, ones that would take years, if not decades, to fully heal. It was a hard lesson in how easily good intentions can be twisted when those in charge lose sight of their purpose. Life in the complex was never the same. The sense of community was gone, replaced by mistrust and resentment. I eventually moved out, unable to bear the constant reminders of what had happened. As I drove away for the last time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of bitter satisfaction. The HOA had been destroyed, but at what cost? What really gets me is how the HOA board just sat back and let John harass people for years. They had to know what was going on. It's not like he was subtle about it. But instead of stepping in and putting a stop to it, they let him keep doing whatever he wanted. That's not just negligence, it's complicity. And then, when they finally did something, it was only because they had no other choice. It's like they didn't care about the residents at all. They just didn't want to deal with the fallout. The whole thing is a perfect example of how HOAs can become toxic when the wrong people are in charge. It's not just about bad neighbors. It's about a system that enables them. What's really infuriating is how the HOA ignored the residents' concerns for so long. People were being harassed, the complex was falling apart, and the board did nothing. It wasn't until things got so bad that they were forced to act. And even then, they couldn't handle the fallout. The whole situation is a perfect example of what happens when those in power don't listen to the people they're supposed to serve. The HOA's failure to enforce rules fairly is what really gets me. They let John and Margaret bully everyone, but when it came to actual issues like maintenance and repairs, they did nothing. It's like they were more interested in controlling people than actually serving the community. The whole system is broken, and the residents paid the price.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.